Welcome everybody to the first Polar Insight conversation. At Polar Insight, we help leadership teams make decisions they can stand behind by staying closer to the people and realities that shape their everyday success. In each conversation, we're going to sit down with leaders, practitioners, and experts in the field of decisions to explore how decisions get made in complex organizations. Today, I am excited to be joined by Paul Gordon from Catalyze. Paul's got over 20 years experience working in this field, and I think you will learn a lot. So thanks very much for listening, and let's jump into the conversation. Hello and welcome, Paul. How are you doing today?
I'm good, thanks, James.
Now, you and I both spend a lot of time thinking about how organizations make better decisions, but kind of from different perspectives, and that's what I want to talk through today with you. So I thought let's kind of start us off with a bit of a simple question.
Yes.
Why do you think intelligent leadership teams still make decisions that they later regret after all of the things which are out there that can help them to do that better? What would be your kind of point of view on that, Paul?
Oh, that's a really good question, and I think I like the way you said intelligent leadership teams, because often we have this collapse that because you're smart, you're going to make better decisions, and the two things are very different. In fact, one of the things that we often see, the way I talk about it is decision making is a skill, and unless you've had some sort of training in decision making and some sort of tools and so on, you can actually be a really poor decision maker. But specifically, you said make decisions that they regret later, and it's actually one of my favorite things. So this is a perfect question to start with, because this idea of buyer's remorse, regret after a decision, whatever the decision might be, is, I'd say most frequently it's because when whoever it was making the decision, let's say it's an intelligent leadership team, there was some aspect of their choice in that decision that they ignored. So let's say they're making some big strategic decision about, I don't know, an M&A. So they're thinking about acquiring another business, and they got some options on the table, and the leadership team are like, gung-ho, yeah, we're going to buy this business. It's going to be great. And then 12 months down the line, they're like, why on earth did we buy this business? What a disaster. And most often the cause of that is when they were making the decision, when they looked at, let's say, their criteria for deciding which business to buy, there was something missing that was important to them, but they didn't take into account. And often the reason intelligent people do that, there's two reasons, actually. One reason is they don't want to admit this thing's important. So, I'm just making this random example, but with an M&A example, if they, why has this acquisition not worked well? They might have a company themselves where they think they're pretty cool and it's pretty funky and chill or whatever. But they go, yeah, but that's a nonsense thing to think about in our acquisition. This is a business decision. We shouldn't allow for that. So they put that on one side, they make their decision. Then down the track, they're going, what have we done? We bought a boring, straightforward company that actually we hate, having part of our business. So it's often something is missing that they care about, but they didn't take into account. And that's often just because they're either embarrassed about it, they think it shouldn't matter. That shouldn't matter to us. We are much more, The other side of the equation is when they take into account something they don't actually care about, but they think they should care about it, and that drives the decision. So same scenario. Maybe they said, oh yeah, we want to really, a company that's got a lot of tenure, that's been around a long time. Maybe they're a new funky business. They're, going through the roof with scale, and they're acquiring. We really need something that's nice and solid and has been around for a long time. And so, of course, they buy this staid, boring company. And again, realize that, well, they didn't actually care about something that's been around a long time, but that drove their decision. And then they ended up with something they regret. So that's kind of the most common thing, I'd say.
And why do you think that happens? What other factors are at play which mean that people kind of divert from what potentially they should be doing to this state that you're talking about?
Yeah, I'd probably say, again, two things. I like twos. I like threes best, actually, but two things. I'd say, firstly, the human condition is actually mostly at the source of everything. And so let's imagine you are the CEO of the, this intelligent leadership team, and you kind of really know that what you're passionate about is this cool, laid back, funky, whatever it is, culture you've got in your business. But every time you say that, the rest of your leadership team say, "Oh, shut up, Paul, come on, we're making a business decision." So the reason it doesn't get carry into a decision is because you're embarrassed about it. People say you shouldn't, or the other way around. Your very expensive advisor you've paid for says you need a company that's got 25 years of tenure, et cetera, et cetera. And so because your expensive advisor told you, you go, well, I better take their advice rather than take into account what I think. So it's often the human condition. The other reason, which is especially on really risky transactions or big decisions and financially significant decisions, is people don't have a way of allowing for that stuff. When someone's, we've got these companies in front of us, we've got all the financials, we've got all the due diligence documents, and, we can compare their EBIT, we can compare their return on cash, we can compare a whole bunch of data and numbers, and it's clear that this boring company is top of the pops. No question, its data stacks up. And then someone says, yeah, but they're not that cool. It's like, yeah, but how do we allow for that? How do we allow for the trade-off between the really great-looking numbers and the fact they're not very cool? And so they don't have a framework, they don't have a tool, they don't have a vehicle, they don't have a way of allowing for that. Which means, again, it's easy just to say, yeah, that's all very well, but again, back in your box, Paul, we're going with the numbers that stack up. Our accountants say so, our advisors say so, our lawyers say so, we'll go that way.
It's a very interesting perspective, because I think something we see in our work is that increasingly we're getting to a point where some of those other maybe more fixed criteria, more kind of data and evidence based criteria, as that evolves and that becomes more efficient and that becomes more productive, it does seem like we're moving into this this new world, really, where some of the things that you're talking about, which I think it's very I think it's a very accurate view what you're saying in terms of my experience. Certainly, I think there is a kind of moment at the moment where we have a really interesting opportunity to invite some of these more personal points of view, personal perspectives of those involved, to be able to enhance some of these decisions. Essentially, I think, as you say, that I think it's this. This move as well in terms of the future of work, really, and how people work with one another, where we're starting to now be much more cognizant of some of these other factors which do impact our decisions. So, that founder or that CEO with their particular point of view, it may sometimes be ignored at the expense of, as you say, a kind of an expensive advisor. But actually, the kind of richness of that point of view and the richness of that perspective is actually driven by a number of different other factors, and can be a really good decision-making criteria to go from. Thinking about that, I mean, you mentioned in your example about two organizations in this M&A example, both with different cultures potentially, and that being something which leads to a far from positive outcome kind of at the integration stage. That type of thing, do you see that it tends to be as divergent as you're saying? So does it tend to be people go, okay, this is what we're like, so we need to, the decision needs to be everything but us to make it good because we're already us? Or does it tend to be other things? Do people tend to use things like, does status get involved in it? So people are trying to, I don't know, buy an organization that is kind of aspirational to where they are at that particular time. Like, it'd be great to kind of hear your point of view on that, just from kind of the different settings, and whether that's within M&A or other organization, other settings you've worked in. It'd be great to hear your point of view on that.
Yeah, it is. So the short answer is yes. Those, and I tend to use this generic term called intangible criteria. So the things that are much harder to measure and kind of have a bit some people call them soft or emotional or whatever. I would say that if you could say the secret, the kind of gold in decision making is really getting inside everyone's heads who are the key stakeholders in making the decision and working out what's really going on for them, and then kind of making that transparent and putting that on the table. So if the CEO is sitting there going, actually, what will really make our company, what will really put the Polar Insights brand right at the top of the tree would be this, high profile M&A with Catalyze APAC. And that's really going to, there's a status that's going to bias credibility or whatever it might look like, is the kind of thing that you kind of want to make sure you've got in your decision if you think that's how it's going to turn out. And so, we definitely see, and so picking a non-M&A example, just a major capital acquisition. So, the kind of stuff we do often is in, multi-billion-dollar decisions. Let's say maybe you're buying a random, not so random example. Maybe you're a defense department and you're buying new helicopters, and you might say, the decision on which helicopter to buy should really just be driven by, specification. Does it meet the user requirement, capability? But actually, where the bit you can often miss there, or two things you can miss. Back to twos. Two things you can miss. One thing you can miss is actually the value of that helicopter could be, by buying a fleet of a certain type of helicopter, we can now contribute to a coalition operation, something that's unique to that coalition. So our status as a defense force is better because we've got something that no one else has, even if it might not be the most capable helicopter or the best one for us. So there's definitely a trade-off there in perhaps status versus specification. The other thing that is fascinating, and we've seen real examples of this, is who's actually involved, who's impacted by the decision. Well, of course, the squadron that's going to fly the helicopters. And it might be easy to forget them and just go, no, they're pilots. We give them a tool called a helicopter and they get on with it. But actually, if you're about to ask a human being to go in harm's way and say, jump in this helicopter and go and complete the mission, their experience of walking up to it and going, I'm glad I got the so-and-so, is going to change the mission outcome. Because if they walk up and go, I can't believe we bought the cheap rubbishy thing from wherever, but instead, no, we bought the stuff that, we spent a bit more money on the human protection systems and a bit less money on it going faster or whatever, those things will really make a difference to the real outcome, which is the completion of the mission with the helicopter. And it's easy to forget those as well. It's easy. The pilots, we just give them a tool, they get on with it. They're professionals, they're trained. But the unconscious bit, and we literally had that. We were partway through a decision process, and it looked like the decision process was going a certain way, a particular capability. And there was we were a bit like, so what do the people who are going to use this, the people on the ground, your pilots or whatever, what do they have to say about it? Oh, literally, the commentary was, they're professionals, they'll do what's required. So, well, it's not going to do any harm to ask them. And it became very clear in the conversation with them that their view of certain models or certain brands, let's say, of it's not really a helicopter, but hypothetically helicopter, would have changed how much they trusted it, how much they could use it to get their squadron mates out of harm's way. Their opinion of that and their view of that was going to be a big difference to them. So you can think of status in two different ways. You can think of that status of we bought the thing we're proud of, which changes how we engage with it. And you can also think of we bought the thing that others value, such as a coalition, which then elevates our status in that world. I mean, is that what you meant by the question?
Yeah, no, it is. And I think it's a very interesting point of view, because I think it really dives into that idea that a lot of this is to do with perspective and how different people involved in those decisions see that reality, essentially. And, as you say, the pilot walking up to the helicopter is going to look at that in a very different way to perhaps the person who is making the investment from a financial point of view. They're going to have different criteria they're making that decision around, and it's going to inform, it would inform the choice that they then end up making. I'd be very interested to understand your point of view so that's a kind of government public sector side of things. across kind of regulated markets and, in regulated sectors. So, whether that's things like defense, whether that's financial services, energy, these kind of larger sectors within society that obviously are based on a lot of trust. They have potentially significant consequences if the wrong decision is made, or people choose a decision that has kind of unintended consequences, let's say. In that context, there's a side of this conversation which is around kind of defensibility, essentially. So I mean, I mentioned, for example, someone making that financial decision around the helicopters as it relates to the pilot's decision. How do you think about kind of defensibility in your work? How do you think about the point of view of making decisions that people can then, demonstrate evidence, et cetera, should they need to? Which I think is something which, certainly from the work that we've done over the last 10 years, we hear time and time again that idea that it kind of needs to be rock solid, basically. I'd love to kind of hear your point of view on that.
Yeah, it's quite a hot topic, and I don't know, we're 15 minutes in and we haven't said the word AI yet, but I'll just add that into the mix. It's one of those things that we know, and I'm sure we'll end up there later, so I won't divert us. I'll answer your question, but we know that as we start to think about AI and its role in decision making, things like defensibility, auditability, show me the trail is going to get more and more important as, let's say, the humans take their hands off the controls a bit more. So it's absolutely a concern. And yeah, as you say, let's say it's an obvious concern in the public service because, of course, you're spending public money, there's legislation that controls what you do. But as soon as if you put it into, and just use our world, let's say pharmaceuticals or pharmaceutical research, pharmaceutical devices, that kind of thing, another regulated industry, is drug development, for example, it is really important. And so again, one dimension is even the part of the process. Let's say you're trying to introduce a new drug and you're trying to, let's say, use some kind of decision process on what indications you're going to have the drug certified for. Then your ability to be able to make the submission your decision process needs to support you in that, right? So, when you come to make the submission, you want to know that as you make the submission, all the evidence you've got for the submission has come through your decision process. So that sort of alignment of the decision process to the submission, the regulatory process, let's say, on the one hand, and then on the other hand, as the regulatory process is considering your submission, or even down the track, you might have been approved, you might be in market, and something might come up that then says, how come you chose to market this drug for this indication, and we've now seen some new emerging side effects, or whatever it might be, right? That's on the front page of the newspaper. Then that defensibility is really important. It's actually, there's a live example. Your timing's perfect, and I won't mention the details, but there's effectively here in Australia at the moment, looks like going to be a Senate hearing about quite significant decision government made, and the basis on which the government made that decision was supported by the way that we think about decision making and so on. And the result is, the decision's been communicated, the public are on board with it, but some stakeholder groups have kind of said, hang on a minute, what's going on? And of course, it's the public's right to go to the Senate and say, can you have a look into this, please? And so, of course, that's exactly when the Senate are then going to say, well, we better look into this decision process and wind the clock back a bit and say, where were the points of what was considered, who was engaged, et cetera, et cetera. So these things are very important, and you could say increasingly important, especially as we then start looking at technology to support decision making, and also in a kind of, I don't know, a world that feels pretty uncertain at the moment, geopolitically and everything else. There's, feels like a lot more risk at risk. And so how to do that is a great question. And, first place is, at least if you've got, it's first thing you want to do is say, what process did you use to make your decision? Well, if you can articulate the process, here's the documentation for the steps that we went through. Here's who was involved. That's a huge step up from simply we sat around and decided. So the process itself is important. And then being able to articulate the inputs, how the inputs were judged, where the data came from, etc., is all part and parcel of what makes a decision defensible. And one of the things, I know you didn't ask this, but it does occur to me as I'm speaking that, all decisions are made in the face of uncertainty. There's this kind of myth that if you've got enough data, you can make the perfect decision. And that's just nonsense, because, of course, the decision impacts the future, and the future hasn't yet actually been written, even if we might fantasize that it has, right? So the decisions has to be made in the face of uncertainty and assumptions about the future and constraints and a whole world of things. And so the challenge is how do you make a decision confidently, even though you don't really know how it's going to go? We don't know that drug might have that indication that drug might have some unintended side effects. Should that stop us making the decision? Probably not. So we've got to make some assumptions about it. So we've got to document those assumptions. We've got to have the basis for how those assumptions were applied. And then we start to add into the mix, expert perspective and opinion. And that starts to become really important, especially in we've got lots of experience of this in regulated type environments, where the end result of a decision is going to have some kind of approval or not through some kind of regulated body or whatever. And to be able to say, well, there's gaps in the data, because there's always going to be gaps in the data. And so we help fill those gaps by expert perspective that can say our expert opinion, which, interestingly enough, in fact, I was facilitating a workshop a year or so ago, and I had one of these experts, a professor from the University of so-and-so, 30 years and blah, blah, blah. And he said, we shouldn't forget that academically, an academic expert opinion is data. And it's easy to, it's kind of, people don't think of that, right? They kind of go, no, data comes from something you measure and blah, blah, blah. But actually, an expert who draws on 30 years of experience and 20 papers and 5 books and blah, 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 when they say, my opinion is this, that's the same kind of data as we measured it over there. And so that's an important, another part of that kind of defensibility, is to say, well, where there were gaps or we made assumptions, we either tested those assumptions, we either proved those assumptions weren't impactful on the decision, or we filled the gaps by inserting expertise, let's say, that can bring another aspect to the data. And that really does help that defensibility, as well as the diversity of people who participated in the process. A big thing. I mean, I think in 20 odd years, we've never worked on a decision that had a single stakeholder. It's always a range of stakeholders. And the opportunity of bringing diverse stakeholder perspective together allows you to go, it's defensible because we looked at it from this view, this view, this view, this view, this view. And from all those views, it's still stacked up. So even if you discounted a couple of views, it still stacks up with the other views. And that really supports that defensibility piece as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, as you say, that, this idea of diversity directly improving diversity of input, directly improving the quality of the decision, essentially. How do you build up the most representative view? And that will be done through building up a view of every single stakeholder involved, what their various points of view are, how that's changed over time. Someone's point of view on one day might be different to it on another day. That adds a kind of longitudinal element into this. I think, as you say, to be able to do that and be able to demonstrate it, I think starts to get to the point of real defensibility. To pick up on your point with the academics, the academic community and the research community, I think it's a very interesting one in that the structure of that sector and the structure of scientific research is set up in such a way to be able to obviously record and communicate ideas that have a level of weight to them, and things like peer-reviewed papers and stuff like that. I think that's it's a very interesting point of view, that one I haven't heard before, of academics contributing, particularly if it's in written form and if it's a published piece of research. As you say, it's not an opinion, it's their point of view based on all of the evidence that supports that point of view. There's obviously lots of things that are required, certainly if you're getting into kind of the larger journals or more kind of respected publications. There's a lot of work that goes in to make sure that people putting things in those publications, that it is based on a huge weight of evidence, basically. And if it's not based on evidence, it won't make it into those settings. And I think as a as a kind of, future of decision making, I think that's a very interesting area to look at from the point of view of how do you take some of these principles that we've been doing for hundreds of years and apply them into other decisions that we might make in this, in the commercial world that is kind of perceived to be totally different. But actually, like the academic world has solved a lot of these problems before and done a lot of work in making sure those are robust, essentially. But to bring it, to bring it back into a kind of commercial context, because I know a lot of the people listening to this will be thinking about it in that context and in the context of their organizations. If we go into kind of practical things that people can do as it relates to decision making on a day-to-day basis. So we've got these huge decisions, extremely complicated, extremely complex processes that can go on for many months and many years. With all of your work, what do you see as things people can bring into their day-to-day as it relates to decision making? You're a senior executive sat in your office in Canary Wharf here in London, or over in Sydney. What are they doing to improve the kind of the quality of their decision making that day?
Yeah, I would say a few things. And the first thing, which sometimes is hard to do, it's always hard to do, and sometimes it requires a bit of help. But when you're facing a decision, is get clear on what the actual decision is that you're facing, because often a decision presents itself not as a decision. So just to go back to our M&A example, it might look like the decision is, do we acquire this company? Really, the decision is probably, how do we expand our reach, right? That's actually the decision that you're trying to make. And one option in that decision is the acquisition of this company. Another option might be a whole new stream of funding. Another option might be whatever. And unless you're clear on the decision you're actually making before you kind of roll your sleeves up and get into it, the risk is what you bring to bear doesn't actually help you make the real decision. Or you end up back where you started with your very first question. You end up going, why did we acquire that company again? Can I remember why? Oh, no, it was something about getting more reach into this particular market or this particular geography. So, we could have done that a different way. Why didn't we think of that? Well, because we answered the question, should we acquire this company? So I say that's one thing people are, the really smart people are being willing to test and challenge what is the decision that we're making here. And always, and this is, again, hard for, let's say, seasoned executives, because, of course, seasoned executives are used to, they're the person, it sits with them, amazing decisions pop out of their head. They're not used to going, just bringing in their 2IC or having a chat over lunch and just saying, can we just shape this decision up? Or getting help from a decision coach or someone like that, just to say, let me just make sure I'm shaping the decision up. So that's the first thing, get really clear on the decision that you're actually making. Then the next thing is, and again, it's surprising how poorly this is done, but is really spend some time on your option set. So what actually are our options? And, if your decision is, how do we scale the company? The options might look different from if my decision is, we need to make an acquisition. So if we need to make an acquisition, the chances are my options are a range of potential companies. Whereas if we need to scale the company, there might be some acquisition options, there might be some other investment options, whatever it might be. So the next thing is, the smart people are going, the first option is never sufficient. I need more options, and I need to have real options, not the kind of options we often see in business case processes. You're going to the investment committee and you want them to commit to this particular thing. So you give them the thing you want, you give them the thing that's far too expensive or costly or risky, they'd never say yes to it, and you give them the thing that's low ball down here so that it's ridiculous, which of course means they've only got one option and they pick the one you want. That's not what we mean by options. What we mean is realistic options that actually you could take and live with. And one of my greatest most common hobby horses is you always want at least 3 options. And people don't want to do that because, of course, they've already decided they want to, I don't know, let's say they want to buy their new ERP from Oracle. That's the decision they want to make. They've had all the great pitches from the vendors, and they're actually going to their investment committee to agree to a new ERP system. But really what they're going to an investment committee is to approve Oracle. And that's, again, the risk and all that is crazy. You got to step back and go, what are some other options that we could have here? So having at least 3 options really helps you make the critical comparisons between those options, so that when you say, here's the way to go, it's not just I like this one first and the rest are kind of there to make up the difference. So having options. And the smart leaders have people in their organizations who are willing to put options in front of them, or who can find options. Now, AI is a great way of finding more options, right? If you can frame a question to AI, here's the decision that we're making, here's a couple of things that we're thinking about, what could some other options look like? AI is actually strong at that, because it can say, well, if you're looking at this acquisition and that investment, what about? It puts it in front of you. It then allows you to go, okay, I can now start to frame up my decision. So that's the other really smart thing, is putting effort into options. And then finally, I'd say where we're seeing consistent success is organizations that have a pretty standardized set of strategic decision criteria that apply to all these big decisions. And, we know certain criteria might be very specific to a decision, if it's a decision about a capital acquisition, or if it's a decision about a strategy, or it's a decision about whatever. You might have some things that are specific, but actually organizations that don't just have, mission and vision and values and so on, but also have the standard criteria that we use in making decisions that are driven from your vision, driven from your key strategy. What's the direction for the next 12 months? Direction might be growth. A strategy might be sustainable. A decision criteria might be sustainable growth. Oh yeah, we're really working on our culture. We've got to drive more positive culture and great employee engagement. A criterion, your standard decision criteria might be employee engagement or employee satisfaction or whatever. Having that set of standardized criteria then means any decision you're making, hiring people, capital acquisition, back to our M&A example, new strategy, shutting down an office, any of those big hairy decisions, you can at least look at a consistent lens through. And what that does, of course, is it means your strategy is now a decision tool. Instead of your strategy being this thing that's in a desk drawer, if your strategy has given you your criteria for your decision, every time you make a decision, you're using that criteria, you are reinforcing we're committed to our strategy, we're heading in this direction. So I'd say that's the third thing, probably clear on what the decision is, really looking to get a good option set, and then having a consistent set of criteria.
And I think that to follow up on that last point about you're using your strategy and using your set of values as a tool from which to make decisions, I think is something which is all too often neglected, ignored, and can be really, really powerful within a business. If you have a set of values that represent who you are as an organization, what you believe in, how you should work together, etc., they can be really important parts of your decision-making process to say, well, we have these 3 options in front of us. Which one actually resonates with the values that we've set for the business, and the values by which we employ people into the business, the values by which we choose who to work with, etc. Any big specifically strategic decisions, but also kind of even day-to-day operational decisions, if you can map that back to a set of values or a strategy, and that mapping works, then that can be really, really powerful, because it's something which then distributes a lot of that power around decisions away from just the leadership team, away from just the executive team, but to a much broader set of stakeholders within that business, and ultimately gets you to a point where even people working kind of on the front line of your business, and this could be a huge enterprise-sized business, you want someone to be interacting with a customer and saying, this scenario has come up. I've got a few choices in front of me of what I want to do. Perhaps the answer is unclear. in a split second, you really want that person to be able to go, okay, well, what can I relate that to? And more often than not, that can be, well, what are the values that we talk about every day? What are the values that which we live in our organization? And what would that set of values do in this situation, essentially, or the person associated with that set of values?
That's a really it's a great point you make, because if I was to add a fourth thing that these really smart leaders are doing, they're doing exactly what you just said. They're distributing decision making more throughout the organization. So they're taking themselves and the exec away as a bottleneck by equipping their organization with what can be relatively simple tools. You see, if everyone is right across those core values, those core decision criteria that we make for every decision, so they're literally front of mind, so they're in a customer conversation, they're in a production conversation, whatever. The thing that comes to mind is, I've got some choices. What are the trade-offs in this choice? Oh yeah, the one that probably drives our positivity culture more than anything else is probably the right way to go. And so that gives a lot of freedom and agency for people in the organization to make decisions. And of course, it means people are living the strategy day to day, which we all know is, the right answer, yet again, so seldom happens. So yeah, I think it's a very well made point there, James.
And on the kind of, if we look at like the recent past around decision making, I know you've mentioned AI today. I think there's potential for a whole conversation just about decision making and AI. Yes. If we put AI to one side just for a period now, is there anything which you feel has shifted over the last, let's say like 2 to 5 years, or even sooner than that? Do you see that there are any kind of major shifts which are impacting how people make decisions, how people are thinking about decision making? Like what feels different today than it maybe did, 10, 15, 20 years ago in this space?
I think, that's a great thought. I would say, and it's interesting, it's probably an interesting cultural dimension as well, if I look from an Australian perspective, maybe compared to a British perspective. But we all heard this term greenwashing, right? When the environment suddenly became something businesses cared about. So they had a head of ESG or a chief environmental officer. They put them in the office down the corridor next to the toilets, gave them a name badge on the door, shut the door, and hope no one ever walked in there. But they could say, we care about the environment. And I think something that shifted in the last 5 to 10 years is that they've kind of opened that door and said, no, hang on, this is actually a more fundamental part of who we are as an organization. So you might say the environment, you might say ESG more generally, so not just environmental impact, but social impact and governance capability, has become something that is actually at the table in decision making, rather than the whitewash, the brownwash, the greenwash, whatever color wash you want to put on it. So I think that's been a shift, and that's caused people to think. You could say what comes with that shift is then saying, well, there are other softer, more intangible things that do matter to our business that we also need to have at the table. So, ESG is one thing, or environmental sustainability, environmental impact is one thing. And just as a slight side point, we've done some interesting work in this area. One of the challenges with things like ESG, it can still drive you back to, we're only making our decisions based on the tangible stuff. Because if you look at ESG, under the E for environmental, you can go, well, we can measure carbon, right? Everyone knows how to do that. There's tons of tools around for doing it. There's ways you can measure it, all that. Great. Our ESG decision is driven by minimizing carbon impact. Yet, of course, environmental impact is so much more than carbon. I mean, carbon is just one thing that you can measure inside of that. And then they go, social. How do we measure our social impact? Oh, we could probably measure volunteer hours spent by our staff working at the local, whatever it might be. But, it's a bit hard. But we're doing really well on carbon. And so the risk is, of course, as it's now, let's say, at the table, it's kind of at the table in a slightly skewed way. You've kind of got this three-legged, one-eyed monster called ESG, where we'll put all our attention on the carbon stuff and not worry too much about the rest, but we're doing okay for carbon. So you could say that's a challenge today, kind of challenge. But I do think the shift has come from it just being literally a greenwash to get the tick, to something that is now at the table. And that's good news, because that means, like I said, what that brings with it is the willingness to consider other things. And you could say the other trend, which that's why when I mentioned the cultural thing, it's because that's quite pointed in Australia, is this idea of diversity, not just, so you and I both talk about diversity in decision making. How do you bring different perspectives? But if you just say diversity and inclusion, and let's park some of the sort of what seem like crazy behaviors in the US. But if you say, there is also becoming a more, you could say, the understanding of the relationship between diversity, equity, inclusion, and workplace well-being it's much more clearly understood, much more evidence-based than it was in the past, which means if an organization truly cares about workplace well-being, it's got to have its attention on diversity, equity, and inclusion, or whatever sort of however that manifests itself. And that, again, is another one of these things you now starting to bring into decision making. Either bringing it in, saying we need diverse perspectives, whatever they come from, in our decision making, or at least saying, we've got our decision making has to accommodate for outcomes that are going to land with different people. And one of the most, you could say, very current topical thing is this idea of neurodiversity and the understanding of what will have a person with some form of neurodiversity in the workplace be productive and engaged and all the good things that you want. Their needs are distinct from someone who is, let's say, neurotypical. And now that's more understood. Again, it's starting to say, well, we've got to think in our decision making about the decisions that we're making. No, that sentence didn't make any sense. We've got to think about the decisions that we're making and the impacts of them on, let's say, a more diverse range of stakeholders. And it's kind of, you could say COVID kind of forced that lens on us, because what COVID did was force this working from home, opened up this whole idea of hybrid working, and has now, in the last few years, has become one of the hottest topics in many organizations, called what's our work from home policy or our flexible working policy. And, that you could say, and I've seen this, it's sort of like you could say a rising tide floats all boats and a falling tide shows who's wearing no trousers, right? And with the falling tide, you can see organizations that are built on an old school thing that's just like, the only way to be productive is you get everyone back in the office, because unless I can see what you're doing, you're not doing anything, right? There's a mentality of that is now under the spotlight. But you could also say that in some respects, the more insidious aspect of that is the other side, which is this rash assumption that giving everyone flexible working and working from home is more productive. And in fact, the data doesn't support that either. So we're in this world at the moment where many organizations are making very hard strategic policy decisions on ways of working and what is our working from home policy. And having to go, well, we never even thought that certain let's say, of our workforce need distinct things. They might need quiet, they might need darkness, they might need no LED lighting, they might need a whole bunch of things. We kind of never thought of that, but now we've got a light shone on it, no pun intended, because of how we had to work during COVID, and now we're introducing people back into the workplace. So that's, I think, another thing that's really shown up in decision making, is that aspect of understanding diversity, how we incorporate diversity, how that affects our workplace, etc. And that is quite fascinating to look, and particularly to look through that one lens of a decision called what is our work from home policy, particularly because it's a decision that affects the entire organization. And there aren't actually that many decisions that organizations make that to that degree, right? It's literally every person who works in this organization is impacted by the work from home policy.
Absolutely. And as you say, that that point of view of who will this impact, what level of investment do we make essentially into this process, and the connection between those two things, I think, is really important. If you're making a decision that impacts everyone, and if your everyone is 100,000 people, you really want to make sure that decision is not only high quality and you get the best possible outcome, But to go back to what we were talking about earlier a little bit, that you can evidence this was our process for getting to this particular decision. These are the steps that we took. These were the people that we involved. Because ultimately, as we know, in lots of different situations, just making the decision is also just the start of the process. There's then all of the impact of the results of that particular decision, which if you're making decisions in very, very complex environments, things will go wrong. There will be mistakes. Things will come up later down the line, and it's for those intended and unintended consequences. That's where having a really clear view of what your process has been and who it involved will be absolutely invaluable. And to add on to one point you were mentioning there, as it relates to kind of these things which were previously seen as quite separate. So you could say, your kind of diversity and inclusion criteria or that kind of part of your business, and then your working from home policy, and also your strategic decision making. Previously we might have looked at those things as all very disparate entities within the organization that don't necessarily have any impact on one another. But if you're looking at how to bring people back into the office, for example, well, if you involve them in a decision-making process, which requires them to be in the office at a particular time, you can start to merge these things for the kind of the best optimal outcome that you're looking for. I'm not advocating that people do that, but I think we are moving into a space, and it kind of rounds off a little bit of what we mentioned earlier around kind of soft and hard things, these kind of soft skills and hard skills. Actually, I think over these last few years, society in general and business in general is becoming a lot more comfortable with this idea that things can be both. Things aren't either kind of soft or hard as they relate to skills. There are things which sit in the middle of those, and in lots and lots of situations, things are both. People aren't coming to situations with just one point of view. They're coming with multiple points of view. One which is a very, maybe a very kind of emotional perspective that they might have. They're also coming with a kind of physiological perspective. How much sleep they've had that particular night. Are they hungry? Are they not hungry? There's that amazing examples of when you want to go to court in terms of whether judges are hungry or not, because that kind of changes their decision making. It's a plethora of all of these things at the same time, and I think certainly it feels like people are starting to go on that journey. But I think there is a whole new, panacea of information across the next few decades and beyond that will give us a much, much clearer view on how people are approaching decisions, essentially, and how best to kind of optimize that process as they go forward. Paul, I've very much enjoyed our conversation today. Thanks so much for your time. If people want to learn a bit more about Catalyze, where's the best place for them to go? How can they find that out?
So, easiest place, of course, is our website, catalyzeapac.com, or I'm happy to post in whatever notes go alongside this, an email address for me so people can reach out to me directly. And of course, I'm on LinkedIn as well. And always, I love hearing just questions that people are dealing with in decision making. Literally, if it's something that we've said today, you go, yeah, but how do you really do that? Then just drop me a note, because sometimes that's the challenge, right? We could say, oh yes, the answer is bring diversity to your decision making. Yeah, it sounds like a great idea, but how do you do that in practice? So I always love to have those kind of conversations.
Fantastic. Make sure that you reach out to Paul, and we'll be back for another Polar Insight conversation very soon. Thanks very much, Paul.
Thanks, James, so much.